The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and cold air. I had been lying in that bed for 2 days with an A4 line taped to my left arm and a monitor clipping steady beeps beside my head. My hip surgery had gone well, the doctor said. I just needed rest and time. Simple enough words for a 67-year-old woman who had never liked sitting still. I was watching the ceiling and thinking about nothing in particular when the door opened. I expected a nurse. I expected my doctor making his afternoon rounds. I even expected my daughter Camille, who had promised to bring me a decent cup of tea because the hospital version tasted like warm cardboard. Instead, it was my son-in-law. His name was Troy, and he was 39 years old with the kind of confidence that fills a room before the person does. He was carrying a brown folder tucked under his arm like it was a casual thing. Like he brought folders to hospital rooms all the time. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He didn't say hello, not really. He pulled the chair close to my bed, sat down, and placed the folder flat on my tray table. Then he opened it, slid a stack of papers toward my hand, and set a pen on top. "Just sign this," he said. "It transfers your life insurance beneficiary to me so I can manage things properly for the family." I looked at the pen sitting in my shaking hand. I stared at those papers for what felt like a very long time. The words on the top page were dense and formal, the kind of language that sounds simple until you realize each sentence is doing something specific that you may not fully understand without reading it 3 times. My life insurance policy was worth $420,000. I had been paying into it for 22 years. I had set it up carefully, intentionally, with one purpose: to protect my family after I was gone. To make sure Camille and any grandchildren she might have would not be left struggling. Troy leaned back in his chair like this was a normal Tuesday conversation. He said it was just practical planning. He said that with me in the hospital, someone responsible needed to be positioned to manage things if the situation became complicated. I told him I didn't think this needed to happen right now. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He said hospitals were unpredictable. He said delays created problems. He said the paperwork was already done and all it needed was my signature. His voice was calm and smooth, the kind of calm that isn't actually relaxed but is instead very controlled. I looked down at the papers again. My eyes moved slowly to the top of the beneficiary line, the section that said who would receive the money. His name was already written there. Troy Baxter. Sole beneficiary. In neat, printed letters. My stomach dropped. I turned my head toward the door. Camille was standing just inside the room, close to the wall, with her arms folded across her chest and her eyes pointed at the floor. She had been there the whole time, I realized. She had come in with him and positioned herself in the corner the way a person does when they want to be present but not noticed. I said her name. She looked up briefly. Then she looked away again. I asked her what she thought about this. Troy answered before she could. He said they had already discussed it together. He said Camille understood that this was the smart and responsible thing to do. He said they were on the same page and that I was the only one who hadn't caught up yet. The room felt smaller suddenly. The monitor kept beeping. The A4 kept dripping. Outside in the hallway, I could hear the quiet sounds of a hospital doing its ordinary work while something very not ordinary was happening inside room 214. I asked Troy why this couldn't wait until I was home and fully recovered and able to sit down with my own documents in front of me. He said the paperwork needed to be signed before I was discharged. He said the timing was important. He used the word logistical like it explained everything. I looked at Camille one more time. She was still looking at the floor. Something was sitting wrong in my chest and it wasn't the surgery. I had been a bookkeeper for 31 years before I retired. I had spent 3 decades reading documents, catching errors, noticing when numbers didn't add up and when the story a page was telling didn't match the story the person presenting it was telling. The urgency didn't make sense. A beneficiary change on a life insurance policy is not a time-sensitive document. It doesn't expire. It doesn't become invalid if you wait a week. There was no logical reason why this conversation needed to happen in a hospital room while I still had surgical tape on my arm. I asked Troy directly why it couldn't wait 10 days until I was home. He said lawyers just complicated things. He said involving attorneys in simple family matters was unnecessary and expensive, and that people did this kind of paperwork on their own all the time. He said I was overthinking it. He pushed the pen a little closer to my hand. I looked at the pen. I looked at the papers. I thought about the fact that he had already put his name on the beneficiary line before I had agreed to anything. Before I had even seen the document. Before I had said a single word that could be interpreted as consent. He had filled it in expecting me to follow. I set the pen down on the tray table. And I made a quiet, firm decision inside my head. I was calling my lawyer. Troy and Camille left together to get coffee from the cafeteria on the ground floor. Troy said he'd give me a few minutes to look over the papers. He said it like he was being generous. Like he was the one doing me a favor by allowing me time to agree to something I hadn't asked for. The moment the door closed, I reached for my phone on the bedside table. His name was Arthur Pendleton, and he had been my attorney for 19 years. He had helped me write my will. He had helped me set up my estate plan after my husband passed away 8 years ago. He knew every document I owned, every account, every policy, and exactly what my intentions were for all of it. He answered on the third ring. I told him everything. I spoke quietly and quickly, keeping one eye on the door. I described the folder. I described the papers. I described Troy's name already printed on the beneficiary line. I described Camille standing in the corner not saying anything. Arthur was quiet for a moment when I finished. Not the kind of quiet that means he was thinking slowly. The kind of quiet that means what you just told him required a specific kind of response, and he was choosing his words with care. He told me clearly not to sign anything. Not a single page. Then he asked me one question I hadn't expected. Did he bring those papers himself, or did someone else hand them to him? I told Arthur that Troy had walked in carrying the folder himself. That as far as I could tell, he had brought it from outside the hospital. That there was no notary present, no witness, no one from any insurance company or legal office. Arthur asked me to describe the documents more carefully. I picked up the top page and read him the header information. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he told me that based on what I was describing, the documents had almost certainly not been filed with my insurance provider. A legitimate beneficiary change requires specific forms issued directly by the insurer, not generic paperwork that someone could put together on their own. What Troy had brought me, Arthur said, might not even be legally binding if I signed it. But that wasn't the point. The point, Arthur said, was that someone had attempted to get my signature on a financial document while I was in a hospital bed recovering from surgery. That fact alone raised serious concerns regardless of whether the papers were valid. He also said something that made me exhale slowly. He reminded me that my estate plan contained certain protections. Protections that he and I had put in place specifically for situations where I might be vulnerable. Provisions that most people wouldn't know to look for unless they had been part of building them. He said Troy almost certainly had no idea those protections existed. Then he said he was coming to the hospital. Don't let them pressure you, he said. I'll be there within the hour. Troy came back from the cafeteria before Camille did. He set a paper cup of coffee on the windowsill that was clearly for himself and sat back down in the chair like he had simply been on a short break between meetings. He asked if I had looked over the papers. I told him I had some questions. He said the documents were straightforward and that questions were just a way of delaying something simple. He said that the longer things went unsigned, the more complicated everything became. He talked about my medical bills in a tone that was not quite a threat but was positioned just close enough to one that I felt it. Then he said something that stopped me completely. He said the payout would help cover everything, and that $420,000 was more than enough to handle the situation properly. I went very still. I had never told Troy how much my policy was worth. I had never discussed it with him. I had never written it down anywhere he could have seen. The exact figure, $420,000, was not a number you could guess. It was not a round number. It was specific, and it was correct, and the only way he could know it was if someone had shown him the actual document. I looked at him carefully. I asked him how he knew that number. Troy's face did something quick and practiced. His expression shifted into a casual shrug, The kind that looks relaxed but happens a fraction of a second too fast to be genuine. He said it was a rough estimate. He said he had a general sense of what policies like mine were worth. He said he had been around enough financial conversations to make an educated guess. I kept looking at him without saying anything. I had learned a long time ago that silence makes people uncomfortable, and uncomfortable people tend to fill the space with things they hadn't planned on saying. He added that Camille had mentioned something general once. Nothing specific. I waited. The door opened and Camille came in holding her own coffee. She looked at my face and then at Troy's face and seemed to understand immediately that something had happened in the few minutes she had been gone. I asked her directly whether she had shown Troy my insurance documents. She didn't answer right away. She looked at the floor again. That was becoming a habit of hers in this room. Then, very quietly, she said yes. She said she had shown him the policy summary several months ago. She said she thought it was fine because he was her husband and they shared everything. Several months ago. He had known the exact amount for months. He had been planning this for months. Troy recovered quickly. He always did. He was the kind of person who could absorb a difficult moment and reorganize around it faster than most people could follow. He shifted the conversation immediately, the way you change lanes without signaling, smooth enough that you almost don't notice it happened. He said we were getting off track. He said this was about practical family planning and nothing more. He said Camille had shared the document because they were a team and there was nothing wrong with a husband knowing the details of his wife's family finances. Then he said his mother agreed that this was the right approach. His mother's name was Vera, and I had met her 4 times over 6 years of knowing Troy. She was a sharp, opinionated woman who had very clear views about money and who controlled it in a family. I asked what his mother had to do with my insurance policy. He said Vera had experience with estate planning and had advised them that getting ahead of these things was smart. He said she had suggested the timing. He said she thought it was wise to act while I was in the hospital because it would be easier to manage the paperwork without the usual back and forth. Easier to manage. I heard what that meant. It meant easier to pressure. Easier to rush. Easier to catch me off guard in a place where I felt small and tired and dependent on other people. I understood the full shape of it now. This had not been Troy's idea alone. He kept talking after that, and the more he talked, the more the picture filled in around him. He said that if something happened to me, someone responsible needed to have immediate access to the funds. He said that insurance companies moved slowly and that delays could hurt the family. He said that having his name on the policy would allow him to act quickly and decisively. I asked him what he meant by decisively. He paused. Then he said that there were opportunities he had been watching. Business opportunities. He said the kind of capital that came from a life insurance payout could be the foundation for something serious. Something that could benefit the whole family in the long run. His business idea. He was sitting in my hospital room, while I was still in a hospital gown, and he was telling me that he wanted to use the money I had spent 22 years paying into, money I had intended to leave for my daughter and future grandchildren, to fund a business venture that he had apparently been thinking about for long enough that Vera had weighed in on the strategy. I looked at him sitting in that chair with his folder and his pen and his carefully chosen words. I thought about Arthur, who was already on his way. I thought about the protections built quietly into my estate plan years ago, the ones Troy knew nothing about. And I thought about how Troy had just told me, in his own words, exactly what he intended to do. The door opened at 3:20 in the afternoon. Arthur Pendleton was 64 years old, trim, with silver hair and a manner that was always unhurried and always precise. He wore a dark jacket and carried a leather briefcase that he had owned for as long as I had known him. He walked into room 214 the way he walked into every room, like he had already assessed it before he arrived. Troy looked up from the chair. The shift in his expression was immediate. He had not been expecting company. Certainly not this kind. Arthur nodded at me first. He asked how I was feeling. He said it the way someone says it when they genuinely want to know and are also quietly noting every detail of the environment around them at the same time. I told him I was fine. I told him, Arthur, this is Troy, my son-in-law. Troy stood up. He extended his hand automatically, the social reflex of someone who had learned that confidence begins with a firm handshake. He said it was nice to meet me. Arthur shook his hand. He said it was nice to meet Troy as well. Then he looked at the papers on my tray table. He looked at them the way a person looks at something they have already been told about and are now confirming with their own eyes. He asked if he could see the documents. Troy said he didn't think that was necessary. Arthur picked them up anyway. Arthur read through the papers slowly. He turned each page with deliberate care, holding the document slightly angled so that I could see his face while he read. His expression didn't change much. It rarely did. But I had known him long enough to read the small signals. The slight tightening around his eyes. The almost invisible pause before he turned one particular page. He reached the end of the stack and set the papers back on the tray table with the same careful deliberateness he had used to pick them up. He said the documents were incomplete. He said that a beneficiary change on a life insurance policy required specific forms issued by the insurance provider directly. These papers had not come from the provider. They had not been processed through any official channel. They had not been witnessed or notarized. In their current state, he said, even if I had signed them, they would carry no legal weight. Troy said he had done his research. Arthur said that was fine and asked who had drafted the documents. Troy said he had put them together himself with some guidance. Arthur asked from what source. There was a pause that lasted just long enough to answer the question without words. Arthur nodded slowly. He said he understood. Then he said there was something else he needed to share with me. He looked at me over the top of the papers with the steady expression of someone about to say something that will change the temperature of a room. He said there was a clause in my estate plan that Troy had no knowledge of. Troy crossed his arms. His posture had shifted since Arthur arrived. He had come into this room expecting a tired woman in a hospital bed and a straightforward signature. He had not prepared for a 64-year-old attorney with a leather briefcase and 19 years of detailed knowledge about my financial life. Arthur explained the clause calmly and without drama. 8 years ago, after my husband Gerald passed away, Arthur and I had spent several sessions restructuring my entire estate. Gerald's death had made certain things very clear to me about vulnerability and timing and how quickly people who meant well could still make decisions that weren't theirs to make. We had built protections into the estate plan that went beyond the standard provisions. One of those protections was specific. It addressed the possibility of someone attempting to pressure me into signing financial documents during a period when I was physically compromised or otherwise vulnerable. A hospitalization, for example. The clause did not require a court order to activate. It required documentation of the attempt. Troy's mouth opened slightly. Arthur said the clause allowed my assets to be moved immediately into a protected trust structure if evidence existed that someone had tried to manipulate me financially while I was in a vulnerable condition. He looked at Troy directly. He said we now had documentation of that attempt. The folder. The pre-filled beneficiary form. The conversation about the payout amount. All of it. Documented. Troy uncrossed his arms slowly. I watched Troy process what Arthur had just told him. It happened in stages, the way understanding sometimes arrives not all at once but in pieces, each one heavier than the last. Arthur explained the trust structure patiently. He said that my estate plan had always included the framework for a protective trust. It had been sitting there quietly for 8 years, waiting in case it was ever needed. The trust was designed to receive my assets instantly if the activation conditions were met. Once assets were inside it, they were governed by specific terms that I had set and that no outside party could alter. Troy said he had only been trying to help. Arthur said he understood that was what Troy was saying. He said the documentation would reflect what Troy had actually done. He laid out the sequence clearly. Troy had arrived at a hospital without being asked. He had brought documents he had drafted himself using an online template. He had already filled in his own name as sole beneficiary before asking for consent. He had cited the payout amount he had accessed without my knowledge. He had applied pressure by referencing medical costs and suggesting urgency. Each of those points, Arthur said, was a piece of documentation. He said that taken together, they formed a clear picture. Troy started to say something about intent. About how his intentions had been good. About how none of this had been meant to cause harm. Arthur said that intent was one consideration. Actions were another. And the actions were already recorded. The shift in the room was something I could feel before I could describe it. Up until this point, Troy had been the one with the folder and the pen and the plan. He had walked in carrying the advantage of surprise. He had expected to leave with a signature. Now he was standing beside a hospital bed watching an attorney explain to him that the document he had brought, the conversation he had started, the number he had quoted without permission, all of it had activated a legal protection he had never known existed. Arthur explained the trust clearly. Once assets moved into the protective structure, they were governed entirely by the terms I had set years ago. The beneficiaries were named. The conditions were fixed. The funds could not be redirected by any outside party for any reason. Not by a son-in-law. Not by a well-meaning relative. Not by anyone. He said we now had more than enough documentation to complete the activation. Troy looked at me. Not at Arthur. At me. And for the first time since he had walked through that door carrying his folder, he looked uncertain in a way that no amount of controlled composure could cover. He said he thought we were family. He said families handled these things together. He said he wasn't the enemy here. I looked back at him quietly. I thought about Gerald. About the care we had taken building these protections. About what it had meant to think ahead for exactly this reason. Troy was realizing something was very wrong. I could see it clearly. Troy started talking faster. The careful, smooth tone he had used at the beginning of the afternoon began to crack around the edges. He said the whole thing had been blown out of proportion. He said he had brought the papers as a starting point for a conversation, not as a demand. He said he had always respected my decisions and that this whole situation was a misunderstanding built on a misunderstanding. Arthur listened without interrupting. When Troy finished, Arthur said one thing. He said the conversation had been recorded. Troy went very still. Arthur said that when I had called him from the hospital room, I had remained on the line and set the phone down while Troy spoke. The call had captured everything from the moment Troy returned from the cafeteria. Every word about the payout. Every reference to his business plans. Every implication about medical costs being a pressure point. All of it was on a recorded line, date and time-stamped, logged with his office. Troy said that wasn't legal. Arthur said that one-party consent recording laws in our state allowed exactly this. I had been a participant in the conversation. I had the right to document it. Troy's jaw tightened. He looked at the folder on my tray table. He looked at Arthur. He looked at me. His eyes moved between the 3 points like he was calculating something and the math was not working out in his favor. His voice dropped and turned hard. He said Arthur had no right to come into his family's business. The tension in the room had changed completely. Whatever performance of reasonableness Troy had been maintaining since Arthur arrived was gone now. The careful voice and the casual shrug had been replaced by something tighter and less controlled. He said Arthur was creating a problem where none existed. He said I was an old woman in a hospital bed who was being manipulated by her own lawyer into seeing threats everywhere. He said Arthur had a financial interest in complicating my estate because attorneys charged fees and the more complicated things became, the more Arthur got paid. Arthur did not raise his voice. He did not change his posture. He simply looked at Troy and said that coercing an elderly person into signing financial documents while they were hospitalized and recovering from surgery could be classified as financial exploitation under state law. He said that was not a personal opinion. It was a legal fact. He said the documentation we had, the recorded conversation, the pre-filled beneficiary form, the evidence that Troy had accessed my policy information without my knowledge, was sufficient to support that classification if we chose to pursue it. Troy said he wasn't coercing anyone. Arthur said the recording would allow other people to form their own opinion about that. The room was silent for 3 full seconds. Then Troy reached forward suddenly and grabbed at the folder on my tray table. Arthur's hand came down on the folder before Troy could lift it. He did it without urgency. Without drama. He simply placed his palm flat on the papers and held them steady against the tray table with a calm, complete authority that made it absolutely clear that those documents were not going anywhere. He said the paperwork would be retained as part of the case documentation. Troy said they were his documents. He said he had brought them and they belonged to him. Arthur said that the moment they had been placed on my tray table and used as part of an attempt to influence me, They became relevant evidence. He said his office would be holding them. Troy stared at Arthur's hand on the folder. He was breathing differently now. Faster. The composure he had arrived with had been stripped away layer by layer over the past 40 minutes, and what was underneath it was something rawer and less polished. He looked at me one more time. I held his gaze without looking away. He picked up his coffee cup from the windowsill. He straightened his jacket. He walked to the door with the deliberate steps of someone trying very hard to look like they are choosing to leave rather than retreating. Then he left. The door closed behind him. Arthur set the folder carefully into his briefcase. He sat down in the chair Troy had vacated and asked me again, gently and sincerely, how I was feeling. I told him I was tired. He said that was completely understandable. Camille came back to the room an hour after Troy left. She came alone this time, without the folder, without the careful positioning near the wall. She came in and sat in the chair closest to my bed and looked at me with the expression of someone who has been crying recently and is trying not to show it. She said she was sorry. I told her I was listening. She said she hadn't understood how serious it was. She said Troy had framed it as practical planning. He had told her that getting ahead of the paperwork while I was in the hospital was simply sensible. He had made it sound routine. He had told her that all families did this kind of thing and that she was being overly emotional every time she had expressed any hesitation about it. She said she had shown him the policy document months ago because he had asked about it directly and she hadn't wanted to seem like she was keeping secrets from her husband. I asked her if she had known about Vera's involvement. She went quiet for a moment. Then she said she had heard Troy and Vera discussing it once on the phone. She said she had told herself it wasn't as serious as it sounded. That people planned for these things all the time. I told her I wasn't angry with her. I meant it. But I also told her that the insurance policy was not the only thing involved in what had happened today. She looked up. I told her the situation was larger than she realized. Arthur came back to the room the following morning with his briefcase and 2 cups of decent coffee, which I appreciated more than I said out loud. He sat down and explained the full picture to Camille as well as to me, because I had asked him to. I wanted her to understand the whole shape of what her husband had walked into and what it had set in motion. He explained that my estate was not limited to the life insurance policy. The policy was significant, but it was one component of a broader structure that included the house I had owned for 26 years, a portfolio of investments that Gerald and I had built together over 4 decades, 2 savings accounts, and the estate plan that tied all of it together. Troy had fixated entirely on the insurance payout. $420,000 was the number he had gotten from the document Camille had shown him, and it appeared to be the ceiling of his understanding of what I owned. He had assumed the insurance was the biggest prize. He had been wrong by a significant amount. Arthur said that Troy had attempted to access the most visible piece of a much larger structure and had done so in a way that had activated protections built specifically to defend the entire structure. Camille listened with both hands folded in her lap. Arthur looked at her calmly. He said Troy had no idea what we had done next. Arthur had spent the days following the hospital visit completing work that had technically begun 8 years ago when Gerald died and we first built the estate plan together. The protective trust structure had always existed in framework form, ready to be activated if the conditions were ever met. They had now been met, clearly and with documentation. He filed the necessary paperwork to move my assets formally into the trust. The house transferred first. Then the investment portfolio. Then both savings accounts. Then the insurance policy, with the beneficiary updated through the proper channels, through the actual insurer, with the correct forms, properly witnessed and notarized. Camille and my 2 grandchildren, whenever they arrived in the world, were named as the protected beneficiaries. The terms of the trust defined exactly how and when the funds could be accessed and for what purposes. Education, housing, medical care, established, protected, clear. Troy's name appeared nowhere in the document. Not as a beneficiary. Not as a trustee. Not in any capacity that gave him influence or access to a single dollar. The trust also contained a specific clause that prohibited any future attempt to alter the beneficiary structure by any party acting under a claim of spousal interest. Arthur filed everything and then called me at home, because by that point I had been discharged, to tell me it was complete. He said there was one thing left. The real reveal, he said, had not happened yet. The family meeting was Camille's idea. She said she wanted everything in the open. She said she was tired of conversations happening in corners and through folders brought to hospital rooms, and she wanted her husband and her mother in the same room with the facts on the table. I agreed. Arthur agreed. We set the date for a Thursday evening 2 weeks after I came home from the hospital. Troy arrived at my house at 6 o'clock. He was wearing a collared shirt and he had that folder under his arm again. A different folder, or possibly the same one with different contents. I couldn't tell from the doorway. He came in and looked around the living room the way he always did, with a kind of inventory in his gaze, like he was assessing what was there and what it might be worth. Camille was already sitting on the sofa. She looked calm in a careful way. I sat in the armchair across from the sofa. My hip still ached, but I sat straight. Troy looked at the chair beside me. Arthur was sitting in it. Troy stopped walking. He looked at Arthur. He looked at me. He looked at Arthur's briefcase, which was open on the side table with a neat stack of documents visible at the top. He sat down slowly on the sofa next to Camille. He said he had hoped we could handle this as a family without making it complicated. Arthur said he was there to make sure it was handled correctly. Arthur opened the meeting by saying he had an update on my estate plan that he wanted to share with everyone present. He said the update was significant and that he wanted to make sure there was no confusion about what it contained or why it had been structured the way it had. He explained the protective trust. He explained how it worked. He explained the activation clause and what had triggered it. Troy started to say the hospital visit had been mischaracterized. Arthur said the recording spoke for itself and that Troy was welcome to review it. Troy said nothing after that. Arthur continued. He said the trust was now fully established and legally binding. He said all assets had been transferred into the protected structure and that the terms were fixed. He said no outside party, regardless of their relationship to any beneficiary, had any authority to alter, access, or influence the trust in any way. He then announced the beneficiaries. Camille's name came first. Her portion was protected and accessible under specific conditions designed to ensure her security regardless of her marital circumstances. Her children, my future grandchildren, were named as secondary beneficiaries. Then Arthur said one final thing. He said that due to the documented attempt to coerce me into signing unauthorized documents while hospitalized, one individual had been permanently excluded from any controlling interest in the estate. The room went very quiet. Troy knew who that individual was. Troy sat completely still for a moment. Then he said Arthur couldn't do that. He said a spouse had legal standing in matters of family estate. He said this was overreach. Arthur said he was welcome to consult his own attorney about that. He said the trust had been structured with exactly this possibility in mind and that the legal foundation was sound. He said the exclusion was not from the family. It was from any controlling or beneficiary interest in my estate. Troy said this was punitive. Arthur said it was protective. He said there was a meaningful difference. Camille put her hand on Troy's arm and said his name once, quietly. He looked at her and something in her expression made him stop talking. Arthur closed his folder. He said the trust was filed, finalized, and beyond the reach of any informal pressure or future attempt to revisit it. He said my wishes were now legally protected in a structure that would outlast any single conversation or any document brought to any hospital room. Troy looked at the briefcase. He looked at the documents. He looked at me sitting in my armchair across the room. His folder was still under his arm. He had never opened it. He put it down on the cushion beside him. He didn't say anything else. The room was completely silent. The plan he had spent months building, the plan Vera had advised, the plan that had begun with Camille showing him a policy document on an ordinary evening months ago, had collapsed in the space of one quiet Thursday meeting. My recovery from the hip surgery took 6 weeks in total. By the end of it, I was walking without a cane and sleeping through the night, which the doctor said was an excellent sign for a woman my age, and which I chose to take as a compliment. Arthur called me on the day the trust finalization was confirmed by the court to let me know every document was in order. He said the structure was as solid as anything he had ever built and that he was proud of the foresight we had shown 8 years ago when we first put the protections in place. I told him I was proud of it too. I told him Gerald would have been proud of it as well. Troy never brought up the insurance again. Not at family dinners. Not in private conversations with Camille that she later mentioned to me. The folder disappeared from his routine the same way the confident smoothness had disappeared from his voice that afternoon in room 214. He was still Camille's husband. That was her choice and I respected it. She had her own conversations with him that were hers to have. What I knew was that she understood now, fully and clearly, what had been attempted and what it had meant. At Christmas, sitting at the dining table with Camille beside me, she reached over and squeezed my hand. She said she was glad I had made that call. I told her I had made it before he even finished placing the pen in my hand. The money meant to protect my family would now protect my family forever. And the one person who had walked into that hospital room believing I was too tired and too sick to fight back had learned the hardest possible lesson. I was never as helpless as he thought.